Hello, this is Jonathan Long. My presentation today will be a big picture study of socio-ecological resilience. I'll start off with a brief overview of issues and some recent research on this topic. Then I'll shift to 3 case studies, the first on wet meadows in Arizona, the second on black oaks in California, and the third on a variety of ecocultural resources in the Pacific Northwest, where the Northwest Forest Plan was developed. All of these involve tribal resources. I'm going to connect these up to examples of monitoring from the draft forest plan for the Sierra National Forest and integrate those sources of information into some take-home ideas about how we can develop and use these integrated socio-ecological indicators. First, a brief review of some of the conceptual frameworks for integrated socio-ecological systems. We can think about both social components focused on human well-being and ecological processes and biodiversity. And a central concept that's emerged in recent years is ecosystem services, which provide a link between those ecological processes and human well-being. This is another case study example I've been involved with in Thailand, where we were advising on climate change vulnerability assessments. And this picture shows a border of one of the national parks there, where native peoples have been clearing the forest for small agriculture plots, primarily for cash crops, but they're also using the forest for other purposes. And there's a lot of conflict in this community between government agencies charged with protecting the forest and various groups concerned with the well-being of these people. And I saw a huge opportunity where a lot of the indicators that people were using to assess vulnerability were either social, focused on aspects such as income, poverty, land tenure, access rights, versus ecological indicators such as impacts of wildfires into the understory, biodiversity, impacts of forest clearing, but very little attention on ecosystem services, which would provide a way to talk about how the ecological conditions would relate to human well-being in these communities and perhaps identify opportunities to try to promote both. And that's really appealing to the promise of ecosystem services, which in this article by Schroeder et al., they suggest that the ecosystem services concept offers a platform for bringing people and their different views and interests together so that we can build bridges between science and practice and help to solve wicked problems. They went on to provide several recommendations for how to do this, including strongly acknowledging existence or intrinsic values, moving beyond Western origins of the ecosystem services concept, stressing non-market instruments, as well as the existing emphasis on market systems, and developing both biophysical and sociocultural value indicators that help to explain human-nature relationships. Other research that's been done, including monitoring design, indicator selection, focused on measuring the right things. People have noted that most monitoring programs end up focusing on precise local measurements rather than more innovative large-scale monitoring using remote sensing, citizen science, and those kinds of approaches. Another paper that I thought was particularly relevant was this one on measuring particles, parts per million with tennis shoes, finding locally meaningful indicators of environmental quality. They really emphasize the importance of connecting up scientific indicators with indicators that are relevant to local communities, particularly so they can participate in understanding those indicators or even helping into monitoring them. Another source of literature that I think is very useful is this work by Van Reeth at the bottom on ecosystem service indicators and how to avoid problems such as gaming the system, following perverse incentives and other measurement diseases. He referred to several, including hitting the target but missing the point with selection of indicators, shopping for different indicators that seem to support the program one is looking at, and focusing on short-term outputs rather than long-term outcomes. So these are all common problems with indicator selection. So some important factors for strong indicators: basing them on holistic views of ecosystem services, having them being practically and reliably measured, including by local community members where possible, making them scalable to large areas, especially using remote sensing or large networks of people doing monitoring, making sure that they're ecologically relevant as well as socially relevant and sensitive to threshold effects, where we can really catch when a system is changing in a significant way that would affect either ecosystem processes or social well-being. First case study I'm going to present is on riparian wetland restoration on the White Mountain Apache Reservation in Arizona. We've done a lot of work there looking at changes in these riparian systems over time, especially in response to changes in grazing management, such as the photos here that show the effects of fencing on some of the culturally important plants, including cattails. We went out with elders to talk about indicators that they saw at these sites and which ones they thought were indicators of positive change and movement towards desired conditions. We ended up focusing a lot on indicators such as channel incision and aggradation, as well as cover of native obligate grass-like vegetation along the channel margins. We found that these indicators were practically and reliably measured by staff as well as local tribal members, including students, that we could scale these indicators out to large areas by aggregating reporting from different sites. They were strongly ecologically relevant as measures of erosion and wetland function. They were relevant to the local community because they helped to address values such as sense of place, cultural identity, and their value for gathering and hunting. And they were sensitive to thresholds when incision could result in forming nick points that would rapidly undermine the services provided at these sites. And we found that, interestingly, dominance of native obligate wetland grass-like plants was a very important indicator, and that diversity, although sometimes that's celebrated as an indicator, that was often higher at degraded sites rather than ones that were very functional, at least on these stream bank communities that are very wet when they're in good condition. So most grasses, forbs, woody shrubs were not desired along the margins of these small streams because they were competing with the native obligate sedges, rushes, and bulrushes. And some taxa, such as cattails and reeds, in particular had special cultural significance, even though they weren't necessarily the most dominant plants in these situations. So this is one of the sites we could see changing over time. Over a 13-year period, we went from having a lot of bare ground, soil, rock, early successional plants, toward a very luxuriant covering of grass-like vegetation dominated by just a few species. There's certainly an increase in woody plants as well, but not on the stream bank and the wet areas as much as further off in the floodplain. I'll compare this to monitoring indicators included in a recent draft of the Sierra National Forest plan, where they emphasize the importance of diverse species composition, especially of grasses and forbs, having high plant functional diversity with late successional functional types represented, and diversity of hardwood shrubs along the stream bank where their potential exists. So just to point out that the indicators in this plan generally were not consistent with the kind of indicators that we thought were important in this tribal work in Arizona. And so I think this highlights potential tension that may benefit from further consideration in the forest plans as they move forward and are revised. So again, the alternative indicators of focusing on the wetland vegetation as opposed to grasses and forbs that are not necessarily wetland species, wetland obligates, and focusing on channel incision. The second case study we'll turn to is California black oak, which is a very important tribal resource, particularly for source of acorns. And we worked with elders to identify what desired conditions for this species would be, including these large canopied trees with relatively low branches to facilitate access for gathering. So some of the other indicators we highlight are the structural conditions of these trees, as well as potentially doing acorn counts, which could be done by local community members or staff, but we can also rely on sources of information such as forest inventory data, which can be scaled out to large areas. The ecological significance of these areas is that these trees are important as cavities for old growth associated species, as well as providing acorns that support many wildlife species. Social relevance is the access to these productive trees helps to maintain gathering traditions, and there are important thresholds because the large trees, which produce the most acorns as well as provide cavities, require decades to regrow, especially after fires, which can top kill these trees. The Sierra National Forest Plan does address black oak conditions in particular. They have some great desired conditions in there, focusing on acorn production and availability of black oak snags, large trees. But the monitoring question in the plan, are black oak populations stable or increasing, kind of misses the main emphasis on the condition of the large trees, because in general we expect black oak trees to be increasing in the future, especially with drier, hotter conditions and more frequent fires. But the fires may not necessarily be reducing the large tree component and favoring the smaller trees. Third case, focusing on the Northwest Forest Plan area in Northern California, Western Oregon, and Washington. Work by one of my colleagues, Frank Lake, has highlighted some of these cultural barometers of ecological integrity, including acorns, woodpeckers, which are used for a variety of cultural purposes, and spring Chinook salmon as particularly important species, as well as some other fish, candlefish, lampreys, that are important for sustaining those communities. Another resource that's particularly important to tribes in that region is large cedar trees, which are used for carving canoes, totem poles, other resources. And so again, these are things that could be monitored using combinations of FIA data, but there are also some things that community members can easily understand, help monitor. They're relevant for wildlife as well as cultural values, and they take a long time to mature and to develop. And if the logs are used when they're falling, then that takes even more time for them to actually fall, although in many cases people are cutting these trees to provide the necessary resource. So in conclusion, take-home ideas: we can focus on indicators that are relevant to and readily monitored by local communities, yet scalable to larger regions. It's particularly important to focus on natural capital that takes long periods to develop, including wetland soils, wildlife species, large trees, and other legacies that are vulnerable to abrupt and persistent losses. This is another example back with the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona, where we were doing community-based monitoring on this particular wetland site following a fire, and you can see the before or shortly after the fire conditions with the channel showing some early signs of significant erosion, and then 8 years later that channel had formed a deep gully. But we had monitoring in there, so we knew the extent of the problem. We weren't able to get treatments done in time to prevent a lot of those losses, but eventually came back and did do restoration treatments there, as well as did preventive treatments at other sites after seeing how quickly things unraveled here. And so if we're going to emphasize promoting socio-ecological resilience, which is a key theme in a lot of our work these days on national forest lands, it's important that we choose integrated socio-ecological indicators. Tribal communities offer many examples because they traditionally reflect well-integrated socio-ecological systems. And for the examples of restoring meadows and forests, it may be pretty easy to modify existing indicators to really hit these socio-ecological values that are important. And where there may be more conflict in approaches, we may consider ways that we can pair ecological and social indicators to better internalize trade-offs between different values. And Lee Tarnay has a presentation on smoke impacts that we've talked about how to do that at the conference. So